Samvatsar lecture. We wanted to have this Samvatsar lecture by Dr. Shashi Tharoorji on 12th March to coincide with Sahitya Academy's Foundation Day, but due to unavoidable circumstances, we had to shift the lecture to today. This is the 36th edition of Samvatsar lecture, and we organized 35 editions without any interruption. These lectures have charmed and impacted many people over the years. These are annual lectures where the Academy would invite a distinguished scholar to talk about subjects that reflect a deep concern for value, or about a literary trend, or a great classic, or about any such topic that would open up new vistas of thinking. We have been fortunate to get so many great minds to deliver these lectures and privileged to listen to golden words of wisdom from them. Truly, these great minds have opened up new vistas of thinking, inspired many to venture into newer paths, and have helped us in learning more. Some of the scholars who have graced this platform in the past are S.H. Vatsayane Agyeya, K.R. Srinivasa Iyengar, K. Sivaram Karant, Binda Karandikar, Sitakan Mahapatra, Nirmal Verma, M.T. Vasudevan Nair, Vijay Tendulkar, C.D. Narasimhaya, U.R. Anantamurthy, Amitav Ghosh, Girish Karnad, Manoj Das, S.L. Bhairappa, and Ramchandra Guha. And last year we had with Professor Vishwanath Prasad Tiwari, and before that Sri Pranab Mukherjee, the former President of India. We are grateful to all of them. For the paucity of time, I have just mentioned only a handful of names. And today Dr. Shashi Tharoorji will be speaking on the great Indian novel. After about 3 decades since its publication and winning our hearts, triggering our imaginations and completely sweeping us off our feet, this great work is continuing to charm us and making many of us to revisit it time and again. Communication has become instant, discussions are frequent, and so are the questions. Every now and then societies reshape themselves and their paradigms. Today, are we at the juncture where we are going to reshape many institutions such as democracy, family, caste, marriage, etc.? That is a question. The great Indian novel opened new vistas and newer ways to think for many of us. Today, this work is very timely, and we are thankful to Dr. Tharoor for agreeing to come here and talk about this work. Friends, Dr. Shashi Tharoor is a distinguished author, politician, and a former international civil servant. He is the chairman of the Parliamentary Standing Committee on Information Technology, and he has previously served as Minister of State for Human Resource Development and Minister of State for External Affairs in the Government of India. During his long career at the United Nations, he served as a peacekeeper, refugee worker, and administrator at the highest levels. Dr. Tharoor is an award-winning author of works of both fiction as well as non-fiction, with more than 15 published books, besides author of hundreds of articles and book reviews in a wide range of publications, including the New York Times, Washington Post, Los Angeles Times, International Herald Tribune, Time, Newsweek, and the Times of India. And his books have also been translated into French, German, Italian, Polish, Romanian, Russian, Spanish, as well as Bengali, Malayalam, and Marathi. And his award-winning book, Sahitya Academy award-winning book, we have taken up into many Indian languages, and we are extremely grateful to you, sir, for giving us a copyright for getting it translated into Indian languages. It is also recognized authority on India, especially regarding its recent economic transformation and future prospects, globalization, human rights, literacy, culture, foreign affairs, and more. And he is the recipient of several awards that include Sahitya Academy Award, Commonwealth Writers' Prize, and the Pravasi Bharati Samman, India's highest honor for overseas nationals, and the King of Spain awarded him the Enco Mainda da la Real Order S. Peñara de Carlos III. I'm sorry if I have my pronunciation wrong. And he was also awarded an honorary D.Litt by the University of Puget Sound, and a doctorate honoris causa in history by the University of Bucharest. With these few words, I once again welcome Dr. Shashi Tharoorji and everyone who are present here. Now I will hand over the mic to Dr. Shashi Tharoorji. Sir.
Thank you very much for that generous introduction. And distinguished President Chandrasekhar Kambarji, distinguished Secretary of the Sahitya Academy, Shri K. Srinivasarao, this wonderful full house in the audience today, friends, lovers of literature, ladies and gentlemen. It really is a pleasure to join you all this evening and to have the opportunity to deliver the annual Samvatsar lecture. As part of the ongoing Festival of Letters organized by the Academy, but particularly to do so in the wake of the many distinguished names that the Secretary has shared with you today. We all stand on the shoulders of giants, but it's a particular honor to walk in their footsteps. Let me begin by congratulating the Academy for once again bringing together a galaxy of renowned literary voices this weekend as part of the festival. It both reflects and reaffirms the Academy's role as one of the foremost patrons of Indian literature. As some of you may know, I had the distinct honor of receiving the 2019 Sahitya Academy Award in the English language for my book, An Era of Darkness, which was a truly special moment in my own writing career. In thinking of my own remarks this evening and the honor bestowed by the Academy, I thought today would mark an opportunity to revisit my first work of fiction, the work that perhaps truly set me off on my writing trajectory, the great Indian novel, which also was, amusingly enough, the subject of my first ever lecture at the Sahitya Academy when it first came out. And that was more of a reading and a discussion. This is going to be a lecture. But I've spoken about the Sahitya, I've spoken about the book at the Sahitya Academy in 1989, and it's nice to come back 33 years later and try to find something new to say about it. I'm planning to use this platform to present a case for why the fundamental anchor of that work, which as many of you know is the epic, the Mahabharata, continues to be relevant to India in the 21st century, and what I tried to do with it. Now consider the evidence. A television series retelling the Mahabharata was the most successful Indian television program ever, drawing an audience of over 200 million at that time and paralyzing life during the hours of its weekly telecast. The Western world's leading avant-garde theatre director made a 9-hour play of the epic, which a multinational cast then performed to enthusiastic acclaim across the globe, from Avignon to Ayers Rock. Shorter TV and film versions of the play were also successfully distributed worldwide. The best-selling book in the history of Indian publishing in English is not some steamy potboiler, not even my good friend Chetan Bhagat's work, but it's the Venerable C. Rajagopalachari Rajaji's episodic translation of the Mahabharata. If the sales of other translations, including more recent ones like veteran economist Vivek Devroy's 2015 translation, were added, the Mahabharata would probably eclipse the next few Indian bestsellers put together. So obviously the 2,000-year-old epic is still flourishing. Not just here in Harvard, which is now a dedicated course on the contemporary relevance of the Mahabharata at Harvard University, elsewhere in academia as well. There's an American professor in Washington, D.C. who offers a multimedia course on the Mahabharata, with students examining it from a dozen different contemporary perspectives, including those of Bollywood, Peter Brook, and yours truly. Which, in modest reference, brings me back to the book. My first novel, immodestly, but not entirely immodestly, as I shall explain, titled The Great Indian Novel. It's precisely the epic's appeal to non-Sanskrit scholars that has helped ensure the Mahabharata's present-day relevance, and of course gave me material for my novel. I am no expert on the great epic, but the Great Indian Novel draws extensively from it, including its name. As I explained in an author's note at the very beginning of the book, its title is not a reflection of my estimate of its contents, but a reference to this source of inspiration. For since Maha means great and Bharat means India, then Mahabharata, after all, can be read to mean Great India, hence the Great Indian novel. So I have to put it simply, use the Mahabharata as a vehicle for an attempt to retell the political history of 20th century India until the time that I wrote the book, so till about the late 80s, through a fictional recasting of its events, episodes, and characters. Now, the Great Indian novel is preceded by 3 epigraphs that frame and underpin this endeavor. The first from the eminent Mahabharata scholar C.R. Deshpande, attesting to the importance of the epic in the Indian consciousness. He says it has molded the very character of the Indian people. The second from its most creative translator, P. Lal, trans-creator he prefers to call himself, preferred to call himself, he sadly passed on, reiterating the case for its contemporary relevance, and I'll quote it a little later. And the third from a non-Indian writer, the great Nobel laureate Günter Grass, urging that writers must experience another view of history and that literature must refresh memory. So my novel stands at the intersection of these 3 ideas, of Deshpande, of Lal, and of Grass. Now there's a considerable basis for Deshpande's view amongst Sanskrit scholars in the classical canon. The grand old man of Mahabharata studies, V.S. Subtankar, put it uncompromisingly, and I quote, "The Mahabharata," he wrote, "is the content of our collective unconscious. We must therefore grasp this great book with both hands and face it squarely. Then we shall recognize that it is our past which has prolonged itself into our present. We are it." That was Subtankar's analysis of the significance of the Mahabharata. Another eminent scholar, Dandelkar, pointed out that men and women in India, from one end of the country to the other, whether young or old, whether rich or poor, whether high or low, whether simple or sophisticated, still derive entertainment, inspiration, and guidance from the Mahabharata. There is indeed no department of Indian life, public or private, which is not effectively influenced by the great epic. It would not be an exaggeration to say that the people of India have learned to think and act in terms of the Mahabharata, unquote. And this is where the P. Lal quote comes in, because he took it a step further and he said, "The epic of Vyasa is not a literary masterpiece out there, somewhere in the past, or tucked away in air-conditioned museums and libraries. Its characters still walk the Indian streets. Its animals populate our forests. Its legends and myths haunt and inspire the Indian imagination. Its events are the disturbing warp and woof of our age. The essential Mahabharata," Lal wrote, "is whatever is relevant to us today." He was writing in the second half of the 20th century. "Whatever helps us understand and live better our own dharma, artha, kama, and moksha. No epic, no work of art is sacred by itself. If it does not have meaning for me now, it is nothing, it is dead." So Lal's view underscores rather than undermines the traditionalist position. The Mahabharata has come to stand for so much in the popular consciousness of Indians. The issues the epic raises, as well as the values it seeks to promote, are central to an understanding of what makes India, India. And yet, the Mahabharata is a tale of the real world, one whose heroes have feet of clay, whose stories have ambiguous ends, whose events range from great feats of honor and valor to dubious compromises, broken promises, dishonorable battles, expedient lies, dispensable morality. That made it ideal for my own purposes as a novelist and a satirist, to take characters and situations that are so laden with epic resonance and to alter and shape them to tell a contemporary story was a challenge that offered a rare opportunity to strike familiar chords while playing an unfamiliar tune. So in my view, the Mahabharata became the ideal vehicle for my own modest efforts to affirm and enhance an Indian cultural identity, not as a closed or self-limiting construct, but as a reflection of the pluralism, diversity and openness of India's kaleidoscopic culture. In the process, it aims to broaden understanding of the Indian cultural and historical heritage while reclaiming for Indians the story of India's experience with foreign rule and its nationalist reassertion, including, of course, the triumphs and disappointments of freedom. Now, in making this case, I'm conscious of the need for a key caveat. This relates to the usage of the term India and Indians, because in his magisterial essay on life and culture in Mexico, The Labyrinth of Solitude, Octavio Paz observed that his thoughts were not concerned with the entire Mexican population, but with rather with those amongst them, quote, who are conscious of themselves for one reason or another as Mexicans, unquote. Now the same applies for comparable reasons to us, because I speak of an India that exists in the awareness and the imaginations of most, but not all, of my countrymen and women. Paz, as many of you know, went on to serve as Mexico's ambassador to India in the 1960s. And I imagine that he saw that as in the Mexico he was writing about in the 1950s, several historical epochs and states of development coexist simultaneously in India. This is still the case, and it would be foolish as well as presumptuous to seek to speak for them all in a generalized notion of Indianness. In the last 75 years, not all Indians have learned to think of themselves as Indians, and to speak of an Indian cultural identity is really to subsume a number of identities, varying depending upon caste, class, region, and language. But this variety is itself, this diversity is itself integral to my idea of Indianness, whether as a writer or as a politician. The singular thing about India, as I have written, is that you can only speak of it in the plural. Given the extraordinary mixture of ethnic groups, the profusion of mutually incomprehensible languages, the varieties of topography and climate, the diversity of religious and cultural practices, and the range of levels of economic development that India embraces, India is fundamentally a pluralist state. Its pluralism emerges from its geography, is reflected in its history, and is confirmed by its ethnography. Indian culture is therefore by definition a culture of multiplicities, a culture of differences. A British friend, asked to explain to a foreigner what made England England, replied, cricket, Shakespeare, the BBC. Although so concise an answer would be difficult for an Indian, it is impossible to imagine any similar attempt to describe India that would omit the Mahabharata. The Mahabharata declares, what is here is nowhere else, what is not here is nowhere. Few other works in world literature could make such an extravagant claim, but in doing so, a 2,000-year-old Indian epic poem is not defending a closed structure. Rather, the Mahabharata has had so many accretions over the years in constant retellings that there is practically no subject it does not cover. Its characters and personages still march across the Indian imagination. Its events still speak to Indians with a contemporary resonance, rare in many 20th century works. The basic story, if it can even be called that, of the dynastic rivalry between the Pandavas and the Kauravas, has been so thoroughly the object of adaptation, interpolation, and reinterpretation that the Mahabharata, as we now have it, overflows with myths and legends of all sorts, didactic tales exalting the Brahmins, fables and stories which teach moral and existential lessons, bardic poetry extolling historical dynasties, and meandering digressions on everything from law to lechery and politics to philosophy. Whenever a particular social or political message was sought to be imparted to Indians at large, it was simply inserted into a retelling of the Mahabharata. As Rajaji dryly put it, interpolation in a recognized classic seemed to correspond to inclusion in the National Library. This elasticity through the ages adds to the timelessness of the epic's appeal. But Lal's proposition raises a larger question. What exactly about the Mahabharata is relevant to us today? Now, Bilal himself has an intriguing answer. Vyasa, he says, quote, posits an intricate dharma, where right and wrong are bewilderingly mixed. His epic is a mirror in which the Indian sees himself undeceived, unquote. The Mahabharata is after all a tale of the real world, one whose heroes, as I said earlier, are feet of clay. The anguished intensity of the Indians' involvement with the Mahabharata can be seen in the way that reference is made to the epic in public life. The Ramayana is cited generally when ethical ideals are respected or expected. The Mahabharata is referred to not when ethical ideas are mentioned, but when compromises are made, shady deals are struck, promises are dishonored, battles are fought, or disasters lamented. And indeed, which Indian, pursuing the incessant political reports that dominate our national newspapers, has not come across references to great conflicts as Kurukshetras, heroes as Arjuns, villains as Kauravas, Dushasans, whatever, you can go through the list. The Mahabharata is an unending source of metaphor for the rhetoric of our public debate. Indian politicians are ever ready to portray themselves as kind of Yudhishthira, to warn overboard rivals that they are Abhimanyus trapped in Padmavyuhams of their own making, or to depict misguided senior statesmen as Bhishmas. I remember the famous, in my student days, when Mrs. Gandhi said of Morarji Desai that he's a man who provides as Bhishma did, and she's referring to Morarji Desai's stand on the abolition of privy purses, a moral facade to an indefensible case. So she found something from the Mahabharata on the political debate over the privy purses. But Lal's argument is not merely at the metaphorical level, though he dwells with great relish on these and similar examples. The Mahabharata, he says, is our doomsday epic, depicting a period of moral collapse that is comparable to that of our times. The Mahabharata, he says, I'm quoting again from Lal, is recommended reading for an age that breeds dry thoughts in a wasteland, speculates fascinatedly on the paradoxical black holes of interstellar space, and cannot be sure if there will indeed be a 2001 for mankind beyond the Holocaust. The 2001 has come and gone, we're 21 years past it, but the essence of the moral turbulence of our times and the uncertainty of our future has been highlighted by the events in Ukraine over the last couple of weeks. Lal finds interesting support for his view in the late French dramatist who wrote Peter Brook's international version of the epic, Jean-Claude Carrière. This immense poem Carrière wrote in 1985, quote, which flows with the majesty of a great river, carries an inexhaustible richness which defies all structural, thematic, historical, or psychological analysis. Layers of ramifications, sometimes contradictory, follow up on one another and are interwoven without losing the central theme. That theme, says Carrière, is a threat. We live in a time of destruction. Everything points in the same direction. The Carrière may well have been thinking of the Cold War still raging at the time, but his point is fair enough even today. In an India of erupting caste and communal conflict, terrorist and secessionist strife, police encounters, and an alarming daily toll of human lives. In all the events that have happened, I will not single out a few. Any work that speaks of a time of destruction cannot but be considered relevant. No wonder that so many contemporary poets, dramatists, and novelists, writing in every Indian language, have found inspiration in episodes of the Mahabharata, which they've retold in a variety of ways. But the message is not a purely negative one. In the face of destruction, the Mahabharata offers a valid response in the Bhagavad Gita's affirmation of disinterested action. Lal indeed argues that the Mahabharata is an epic of action and that its core moral is to show the primacy of action. Indeed, as Kirti Shashidharan, author of the Dharma Forest, a fascinating and moving contemporary retelling of the final days of the war at Kurukshetra, puts it, the Mahabharata is not a bland didactic text. Instead, it suggests explicitly that even as individuals try to arrive into that state of dharma, there are other constraints that will impinge our efforts. Constraints such as individual talents, ephemera from previous lives, social status, the era into which we are born, the generosities of the gods, or fortune, or both. Like an astute psychoanalyst who draws out the contours of the autobiographical narratives we carry in our head by letting our self-descriptions travel far and wide, including in entanglements and self-contradictions, the Mahabharata reveals our difficulties with interpreting dharma by forcing us into situations involving context and dilemmas, unquote. The events of the epic as they unfold offer other straws for drowning modern optimists to clutch. Rajaji saw the epic as pointing to the vanity of ambition and the evil and futility of anger and hatred. C.V. Narasimhan, then a senior United Nations official, went further, identifying a theme of peace and reconciliation in the Mahabharata, which had a special application in the days of the Cold War, and perhaps even more so in an era in which a hot peace, littered with little wars, has broken out at the end of the Cold War. Professor Barbara Stoneman Miller, who was Peter Brook's scholarly consultant on the play, declared that the purpose of the Mahabharata is to teach that good ultimately triumphs, even in a time of cosmic destructiveness. Lal himself, after focusing on the didacticism of the Bhagavad Gita, added to his analysis the point that the end of the Mahabharata underlines the futility of revengeful warfare and restores the validity of Arjuna's compassion. What do these contradictory exegeses suggest about the essence of the Mahabharata in today's India? They reflect certainly the undeniable fact that the great epic, like many great epics, has the capacity to be all things to all men, or all people. The hubristic claim for the epic, in its own words, what is here is nowhere else, what is not here is nowhere, was thus quite literally true, at least over the 1,000 years that it took the epic to arrive at its settled shape around 400-500 AD or CE. Whereas the classical Indian Shastras were treatises on Artha, Dharma, Kama and Moksha, the Mahabharata uniquely is simultaneously Artha Shastra, Dharma Shastra, Kama Shastra and Moksha Shastra, a fifth Veda, as it has been called, of material and spiritual, physical and metaphysical life. But unlike the other four, I'm going to be a little contentious here, it is a secular and not a religious work. It is a Veda of the Indian masses, not of the priests. Some scholars consider the eclecticism of the epic valuable. Father Robert Antoine, the remarkable Jesuit Sanskritist, saw in the Mahabharata a mirror of life, a mirror of Indian life through several centuries, a mirror in which popular beliefs, social customs, religious practice and speculation, folklore, civil and criminal law are all reflected. Others like R.C. Dutt were less charmed, seeing the congeries of elements as an unattractive farrago. Either way, to distill a single absolute message from the epic as a whole seems to be a disingenuous exercise. The Mahabharata offers enough textual evidence for practically any conclusion you wish to derive from it. Look at some of the issues the epic has been cited on in recent years. The great climax of Kurukshetra and its aftermath have given the Mahabharata its standing as the great tale of war and destruction, an urgent reminder of the perils of the nuclear age. The discussion between Krishna and Arjuna in the Bhagavad Gita has been seen variously as upholding righteous war, rejecting pacifism, underlining compassion, articulating an ethic of action, and stressing the importance of duty, including caste duty. Draupadi's challenge to the male elders when she is lost by Yudhishthira in the game of dice has been hailed as a spirited battle cry for women's rights, but others have recalled that the epic, at least in its southern recension, demeans and belittles women in many places. In Deshpande's words, the Mahabharata claims that if a man has 1,000 tongues, lives for 100 years, and does nothing except describing the faults of woman, he will die without finishing the job. I mean, that's apparently a line from some of the recensions of the Mahabharata. Many of the values and mores of the epic would be seen as illegal, immoral, or impractical today. Controversy still rages over whether Draupadi really had five husbands. The text can be read to mean that she was married to all of them, but also to support the conservative view that she was only married to the eldest, Yudhishthira, the only one whose freedom she asked for when Dhritarashtra offered her a boon. So again, I return to that point. The Mahabharata is what you make of it. Its relevance to today's India is the relevance that today's Indians want to see in it. After all, the epic has, throughout the ages, been the object of adaptation, interpolation, reinterpretation, and expurgation by a number of retellers, each seeking to reflect what he saw as relevant to its time. Its contemporary retellings, whether B.R. Chopra's soap operatic version on television, or mine in satirical fiction, or even the 2010 Bollywood blockbuster flick Rajniti, directed by Prakash Jha and starring Ranbir Kapoor and Katrina Kaif, among others, all of this merely confirms the Mahabharata's traditional status as the repository of the national myth. This includes the stories, the ideas, the social and political customs and practices, the prescriptions and values which the reteller considers significant to his or her retelling. In this sense, to retell the Mahabharata is simply to retell or recall the kind of stories that Indian society tells about itself. Since foreign policy is on many of our minds, ever since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, it's interesting that our own foreign minister has used the rubric of the Mahabharata in his book, The India Way, Strategies for an Uncertain World. While explaining our foreign policy paradigm, he draws on the characters of Balarama and Rukmi, both of whom stayed out of the Battle of Kurukshetra to explain India's non-alignment policy. And maybe that explains our neutrality and abstention on Ukraine. The larger point to be made is that in many cultures, myths and epics both contribute to and reflect the national consciousness. India has inevitably changed in the 2000 years since the original Mahabharata was composed. What I ask myself, would a 20th century Vedyas tell about his India, about the great events of his times? So I use the great epic as a framework for a satirical reworking of the major Indian political events of the 20th century, from the days of British colonial rule to the struggle for freedom, and of course the triumphs and disappointments of independence. In the process, I've tried to reject some old assumptions derived as much from the colonial view of India as from India's own uncritically accepted versions of our past. In my story, I have set out to explore what made India and nearly unmade it, and to consider the nature of truth in life as in fiction, in tradition as in history. The choice of historical events to portray was easily made. The mode of their portrayal was another matter. That the Mahabharata characters and episodes mean something to most Indians added a dimension to the fiction that the novelist's craft alone could not convey. In applying the story of Gandhari, the epic heroine who tied a blindfold over her eyes in order not to see more of the world than her blind husband, to the much sacrificing, neglected wife of a visionary nationalist, or in changing the outcome of the fight with the demon Bakasur to mirror the nature of the Sino-Indian War, I am borrowing from ancient tradition to make a point about recent history. At the same time, I did not want to descend to the national tendency of hagiology, of making people into saints. With subjects as sensitive as tradition and history, I judged a degree of irreverence to be essential in the telling. All the more so indeed, since I would be exploring potentially portentous themes. I took heart from the conviction that irreverence in the Indian tradition is not sacrilege. As the Mahabharata amply demonstrates, the epic itself describes and ascribes human qualities, imperfections, base motives, even to the gods. Now, of course, my irreverence is not an end in itself. In the area of style, for instance, I frequently broke into light verse, and not merely for amusement, I was deliberately recalling the fact that many translators of the Mahabharata, defeated in their attempts to convey the special quality of the world's longest epic poem, have tried to combine prose and poetry in their renditions with varying degrees of success. My various literary and less than literary devices serve as an attempt to look at Indian political history through the refraction of two different kinds of light. One is the light cast by the past, by the values taught to us in our mythology, by the examples set by the epic, by the Mahabharata. The other is the light cast by a satirical view of the present, which by deliberate simplification and fictionalization, some might even say conscious distortion, throws certain trends and issues into sharper relief than history makes possible. This certainly applies to the real-life parallels with the Mahabharata that reviewers have been quick to seize upon. But it is also valid where no parallel exists. To me, for instance, the upright Yudhishthira's smugness and hypocrisy found a contemporary echo in Murarji Desai, while the Ekalavya story, where the lower caste boy who's mastered archery by eavesdropping on Drona's classes cuts off his thumb on Drona's demand, had to be changed, because I could not swallow that story in the 20th century. At the same time, the yoking of the Mahabharata to modern history restricted some of my fictional options. As the novel progressed, I was obliged to abandon novelistic conventions and develop some characters who were walking metaphors. Draupadi, there is the product of a relationship between our first nationalist prime minister and the last viceroy. And as a child who could not be acknowledged in that way, is adopted by a low-caste servant called Mokrasi. So she is a Draupadi-mokrasi, which is, I'm afraid, somewhat obvious as a metaphor, but the idea is she became emblematic of Indian democracy in the novel, and her attempted disrobing was a symbol of what was sought to be done to democracy during the emergency. Equally, the story of Jarasandha, the king who was defeated by being torn in two and flung in different directions, mirrored the 1971 breaking of Pakistan. Pakistan is torn up and thrown into different directions. So these were the ways in which the epic was reinvented in the satire. Now all this needed a style as varied in tone, form, and scansion as the epic itself, with its own numerous interpretations and digressions. The story of India, like that of the Mahabharata, had to come across as a tale of many tellers, even if it is ascribed only to one. This is why I agree with the critic who has suggested that the great Indian novel speaks for India multiple realities and multiple interpretations of reality. So I would suggest that's the epic. And so does Indian culture, that elusive construct. Throughout my novel runs an acknowledgement of the multiplicity of truth and a conscious evocation of the many truths that have helped give shape and substance to the idea of India. My fiction is infused in this sense with the greatness of India, of Mahabharata, a greatness that has emerged from the fusion of its myths with the aspirations of its history. My motivation was a conscious one. Most developing countries also formally colonized countries, and one of the realities of colonialism is that it appropriated the cultural definition of its subject peoples. Writing about India in English, I cannot but be aware of those who've done the same before me, others with a greater claim to the language but a lesser claim to the land. Think of India in the English-speaking world even today, and you think in images conditioned by Rudyard Kipling and E.M. Forster, by the Bengal Lancers and the Jewel of the Crown. But their stories are not my stories. Their heroes are not mine. And my fiction seeks to reclaim my country's heritage for itself, to tell in an Indian voice a story of India. Let me stress, a story of India, for there are always other stories and other Indians to tell them. Of course, mine is an Indian voice in the English language. Our multiple identity is expressed in a multiplicity of tongues. At the same time, as an English language writer, I acknowledged that the colonial connection helped us find our Indian voice. Early in the novel, a British official remarks, "Basic truth about the colonies is Anytime there's trouble, you can put it down to books. Too many of the wrong ideas getting into the heads of the wrong sorts of people. If ever the empire comes to ruin, Hislop, mark my words, the British publisher would be to blame. Quote unquote. It was no accident that my novel was first published by a British publisher. And so my allusions are not only to Indian myths, ancient and modern. I've tried in the story and its metaphors and stray references throughout the text to take account of other fictional attempts to depict the Indo-British encounter, which is why there are chapters called Passages Through India and The Bungle Book, and even in another sly dig at Kipling, a chapter called Hymn. It is no accident that the fictional recreation of the Jallianwala Bagh massacre in this novel takes place at the Bibigarh Gardens. Paul Scott took the Bibigarh from Indian history, the massacre of English civilians in 1857, to make it the site of the rape of Daphne Manners by several Indians in his otherwise admirable The Jewel in the Crown. I'm hardly the first to point out that the use by both Scott and E.M. Forster of rape as a metaphor for the colonial connection is a bit odd, since the facts of imperialism would suggest that if any violation occurred, it was of India by the English, and not the other way around. And so I reclaimed the Bibigarh Gardens for my side, as it were, by casting it as a location for a historical massacre of Indian civilians by British troops. No name in the book, not even of a minor character or place, is casually chosen. Each is derived either from the epic itself, so Lord Drupad, for instance, the last Viceroy of India, is an anglicization of King Drupad, or from writings and writers, Kipling, Scott, Basham, Beverley Nichols, who all written about India. Or sometimes it's a reference to direct geography. Kamiya is obviously Goa. Hungary Das is a personification of Hungary during the 1956 Soviet invasion, and so on. So in reminding readers of an epic past, I'm not writing of some atavistic view of India, an India of distant greatness, untouched by the rest of the world. In fact, the sensibility from which my narrator speaks is an eclectic one, heir to centuries of Hindu, Muslim, and colonial rule. At the same time, I see his telling of the story as part of the challenge of post-independence development, a narrative to set alongside the railway lines, the steel mills, the space stations of the new India. The novel begins with the proposition that India is not, as people keep calling it, an underdeveloped country, but rather in the context of its history and cultural heritage, a highly developed one in an advanced state of decay. Now, such sentiments are, of course, the privilege of the satirist. But the notion of decay apart, I'm trying to remind readers of an India that was indeed highly developed once. An India that evolved a settled civilization 5,000 years ago, an India whose level of art, architecture, literature, and philosophy made it perhaps the most developed country on earth in 300 BC. An India that invented the zero and the decimal system. An India that evolved two major systems of classical music and 5 of classical dance. Developed highly sophisticated techniques of medicine and meditation and surgery. Exported silk and spices. And was the birthplace of 4 of the world's major religious faiths, as well as home to many more. I could go on, but I'm not seeking to romanticize a mythic past. Rather, when my cantankerous old narrator, Ved Vyas, is actually a retired politician in his dotage and in his anecdotage, when he declares at the beginning of the novel that everything in India is overdeveloped, he's deliberately provoking his readers to forget their usual view of an underdeveloped country as one devoid of everything the material world today generally values. The telling of the story of India, I try to evoke an idea of development that transcends, but does not deny, the conventional socio-economic indices. Now, I realize I may be providing fodder for those who have penned learned analyses about some Indian writer's anxiety of Indianness. That was the theme of my lecture at the Sahitya Academy a few years ago, the anxiety of Indianness. To me, my Indianness is not a matter of anxiety. I see cultural reassertion, the reassertion of a pluralist Indian culture, as a vital part of the enormous challenges confronting a country like India, as vital as economic development. We're all familiar with the notion that man does not live by bread alone. In India, it argued that music, dance, art, and the telling of stories, literature, sahitya, are indispensable to our ability to cope with the human condition. Man does not live by bread alone, but why does man need bread? To survive. But why survive if it is only to eat more bread? To live is more than just to sustain life. It is to enrich and be enriched by life. Our poorest men and women feel the throb of culture on their pulse, for they tell stories to their children under the starlit skies, stories of their land and its heroes, stories of the earth and its mysteries, stories that have gone into making them what they are. And as I suggested in my second novel, Show Business, they see and hear stories too in the flickering lights of the thousands of cinemas in our land, where myth and escapist fantasy intertwine and moral righteousness almost invariably triumphs with the closing credits. In India and elsewhere, there is no development without fiction. Without culture, development becomes mere materialism, a set of figures on GNP tables, a subject for economists and planners, rather than a matter of people. And if people are to develop, it is unthinkable that they would develop without culture, without song and dance and music and myth, without stories about themselves, and in turn without expressing their views on their present lot and their future hopes. Development implies dynamism. Dynamism requires freedom, the freedom to create. Creativity is both a condition and a guarantee of culture. This is why it is worth retelling our ancient stories in new and original ways, why literature, as Grass would have it, must refresh memory. As we hurtle into the 21st century, we need ways of remembering all that happened in the previous 20, or in India's case, the previous 35. As a novelist, I believe in distracting in order to instruct. My novels are to some degree didactic works masquerading as entertainment. I subscribe to Molière's credo, le devoir de la comédie est de corriger les hommes en les divertissant, which is very simply you have to entertain in order to edify. But edify to what end? What is the responsibility of the creative artist, the writer, in a developing society? In this exegesis about my own novel, I have pointed to one responsibility. That is to contribute towards and to help articulate and give expression to the cultural identity, shifting, variegated and multiple in the Indian case, of our post-colonial society. The vast majority of developing countries have emerged recently from the incubus of colonialism, which has in many ways fractured and distorted their cultural self-perceptions. Development will not occur without a reassertion of identity, that this is who we are, this is what has made us, this is what we are proud of, this is what we want to be. In this process, culture and development are fundamentally linked and interdependent. The task of the creative artist is to find new ways and revive old ones of expressing his or her culture, just as society strives through development to find new ways of being and becoming. But as I have explained, it cannot be a closed interpretation of culture. It cannot be narrow-minded bigotry of what we call communalism. It has to be expansive, all-embracing, honoring multiple truths. In reiterating the epic, the reteller and his audience are recalling the shaping of their own cultural identity. Yet in this identity asserting quality of the Mahabharata, this is also, to some observers, made it dangerous in contemporary India. In fact, back in the 80s, the cultural commentator Chidanand Dasgupta, father of Aparna Sen, wrote, "For the lost generation of today," I'm quoting him, "a generation that has become incapable of reading it in the original and too impatient even to read complete translations, the degraded version on television is still a revelation of an unsuspected facet of our national heritage." But in the process, Dasgupta regretted that the votaries of Hindutva had laid claim to it, that one of the world's greatest and most universal epics had been reduced to the religious text of a community. The Bengali novelist and writer Sukumar Mitra, deploring the transfigurement of the epic into a religio-didactic spectacle, saw a sinister purpose behind the TV-inspired Mahabharata revival. I quote Mitra, "The message is that modern Bharata must be turned again into a Dharmakshetra Kurukshetra to regain for the saints and God's chosen communities the right to perform selfless karma. In the present troubled state of Bharat, God's agents, aided by an enthusiastic Doordarshan, are stirring up 82% of the country's souls to the doom of the rest, to receive their Redeemer for the re-establishment of Dharma. Now, the re-establishment of Dharma, properly understood, in and of itself is highly disturbing, and I've urged it, in fact, in my early books. But that was not what Mitra meant. His concern was that the televised epic would become a vehicle for Hindu chauvinism, and that is indeed the great worry, as now we're hearing the epic will be remade also for television. It's interesting, at that time, what's interesting is that the epic was actually made into television, famous B.R. Chopra production, and the screenplay was written by a Muslim dialoguist, Rahim Masoom Reza. And its production values probably had more to do with Bollywood kitsch than with Hindu atavism. But to be remaking it in an era of overt Hindutva and communal polarization, Sukumar Mitra's warning sounds even more relevant. In any case, there is little doubt about the national trend toward the increasing communalization of religious faith, a trend which the ancient epics are wrongly being called upon to subserve. In the case of the Mahabharata, it is particularly ironic to use it for communal polarization. During a literary reading in New Delhi in 1991, I was asked whether I was not worried about helping to revive the epic at a time when fanatics of various tribes were reasserting Hindu pride in aggressive and exclusionist terms. I responded at that time that to me the Mahabharata, unlike the explicitly religious Ramayana, is a purely secular epic. Its characters, with the sole exception of Krishna, are not divine, and their deeds are as human and as capable of greatness and debasement, of success and of folly, as those of any of our contemporary figures. And as befits a truly Indian epic, there is nothing restrictive or self-limiting about the Indian identity it asserts. It is large, eclectic and flexible, containing multitudes. So I'm glad that the great Indian novel is still being reprinted and read over 3 decades after I wrote it. I find it immensely gratifying when young people who were not born when the book was first published come up to me clutching copies of it, seeking my signature and telling me how much they've enjoyed it. If there is a message to my book, it is a message that I've derived from the Mahabharata, and it's twofold. First is the need to re-examine all received wisdom about India, to question the certitudes, to acknowledge the imperfections and face them. And the second is to do so through a reassertion of dharma, defined not just as religion, but as a whole complex of values and standards, some derived from myth and tradition, some derived from our ancient and contemporary history, by which India and Indians must live. In this approach, which is of course no more and no less valid than anybody else's approach, any of those through which other conclusions have been drawn for today's India, I hope I have been faithful to the spirit of the Mahabharata, despite all the liberties that I have taken with it. And I hope, of course, through the novel, to have demonstrated its continued relevance all over again. Thank you very much for listening to me this evening. Thank you so much. Too much.
Thank you, sir, for your excellent lecture. This is the one line concluding, I should say. Sir is very busy. In spite of his busy schedule, he made it. Actually, he has agreed to deliver this lecture in the month of February, where when we thought of having our Festival of Letters. He has agreed a year long, but when we changed the dates, he has his busy schedule for the month of March. But in spite of that, he has made for today, and that shows how his commitment to the literature and how his respect to the institution. Thank you, sir. Thanks for coming. And also, thanks to every one of you for being here and making this annual lecture a great successful. Thank you so much.
सर शशि सर का आपने क्वेश्चन आयर सेशन नहीं रखा नॉवल पे, वो तो रखना चाहिए था ना, एक सत्र उस पर भी रहना चाहिए था।
नहीं, बात में देखेंगे आज का तारीख में।
अच्छा
देखिए सर बहुत बिजी है, एक्चुअली बिफोर 7 you should have left.
एंड स्ट्रीम खत्म हो गया, भीड़ कर दिया।